name is Tom. I'm a volunteer walking tour guide with the Museums on the Green, and due to the COVID virus situation that's going on right now, we're going to do a virtual walk and cover part of the walking tour that we would normally do in the summertime. And so right now the first stop is going to be the Captain William Baudfish House, and the Captain Baudfish House is right here to my left. Captain Baudfish built this house in about 1814. He was one of the youngest sea captains to ever be promoted to full captain on Cape Cod. Back in the old days, everybody either worked by going to sea or farming, things like that. Captain Baudfish was either 19 or 20 years old when he attained the rank of full captain. Captain of a large ship is the only description I have found of a ship. I did find out that he was a merchant captain and that his route occasionally took him to Bremen, Germany. So he would sail across the Atlantic shipping goods, and he was dead by the age of 35. He died of natural causes while he was in Falmouth. He's buried in the old Falmouth burying ground, and if we get that far today, I will show you his grave. And that's the Captain Baudfish House, which is today the parsonage for the Congregational Church, which will be our next. We'll be in front of the Falmouth Congregational Church. This is the oldest church in Falmouth. The church continued itself going way back to the beginning of the settlement of the town. This building is the 5th church building that they have had. Prior to the building that we're looking at right now, the church was situated right where we're standing in the middle of the Falmouth Village Green. So if you count the church that we're seeing today as building number 5, buildings number 4 and 3, we're in the middle of the green where we are. Buildings number 2 and 1 were down by the old burying ground, which hopefully we'll get to. If you look at the church, way up high in the steeple above the clock where those vents are in the steeple, right behind those vents is located a Paul Revere bell. The church purchased that bell from Paul Revere himself in 1796. The church still uses the bell. It rings every hour, and maybe if we're lucky enough we'll hear it ring. It's a little bit after the hour now, so it'll probably be later on during the walk, but hopefully we'll get to hear it ring. And we are now standing in the middle of the Falmouth Village Green. Everybody in Falmouth knows this area as the Village Green. If you've lived in Falmouth for more than a week, you will know where the Village Green is. But if somebody were to ask you, how do I get to the training field? You would probably be sent to the football field. Or if somebody said to you, how do I get to the meeting house lot? You would have no idea where the meeting house lot is. Well, the Falmouth Village Green was called the meeting house lot because the meeting house, the church, used to sit upon this lot. It was also called the training field because the Colonial militia used to train upon the very field it was standing on. Most people refer to it today as the Village Green, but this green was laid out here in 1749. So before the American Revolutionary War, this Village Green was here, and the citizens of Falmouth were utilizing it. And right now, across the road is the home of Benjamin Sanford. Benjamin Sanford and his family resided in that house. That house was built right around 1750. So that's one of the oldest houses that is directly adjacent to the Village Green. Benjamin Sanford was a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and his occupations were varied. He was a cabinet maker, he was a hatter, he made hats, he was an undertaker, and he was a local politician. I always thought it was unusual that those occupations seem to be totally unrelated, but one person who came on the walk with me a few years ago told me that the cabinet maker and the undertaker were very often the same guy back in those days. So that's the home of Benjamin Sanford. Now I'll show you his family plot when we get to the old burying ground. If you look at the photograph, folks, this photograph was taken in 1858. It's a photo taken of the home of Braddock Dimmick. Braddock Dimmick built the house about 1804. And if you now take the photograph away and look at the house, you can still see the Village Green fence, you can see the house. And on the corner, right behind the orange barrels, is where that horse and wagon had been parked in 1858. This photograph, folks, was taken in 1870. It shows the Falmouth Village Green, it shows the Congregational Church, and it shows Captain William Baudfish's house. Look at the photograph and look at the horse and buggy parked in front of Baudfish's house. So right across the way is Baudfish's house. There's the Congregational Church. And this fence post right here is the fence post that appears in the photograph. So that's 1870. You can see how little the village green has changed except for the horse and buggy. The house we're looking at across the street, folks, is not an old house. That house was built in the very early 1990s. And the house had to be built in the style of all the other houses around the village green. That was part of the deal that was made with the owners when they were discussing whether or not to allow the house to be built in this historic area. One of the funny stories about the house is that after it was finished, there was a complaint filed, and the complaint was that the house did not look like all the other houses. And the feature that they were complaining about that they said did not look like the other houses was the fact that this house did not have shutters on it. And the people who built the house had done a lot of research. They had people researching for them, and they were able to prove that the houses back in the late 1700s did not have shutters on the windows yet. So all of the old houses that are the real old houses with the shutters have apparently been added later and make the house that we're looking at actually more historically accurate than some of the old houses built in the 1700s. Right now, folks, we're looking at a photograph of the village green and the end of Hewins Street, which is right across from where we're standing. If you look at the photograph, you'll see a telephone pole, you'll see a very old automobile, a bunch of people around the village green, some of them with bicycles, some women with very fancy dresses on. And now if we turn the camera and look at the green, we're actually looking at the same view that was photographed in 1907, and the occasion that was taking place in the middle of the green in 1907 was part of the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the discovery of Cape Cod by an English explorer whose name was Bartholomew Gosnold. Now the photograph that we're looking at now is taken in the 1870s, and it shows Main Street, Falmouth, it shows the Falmouth Village Green, and it shows the Congregational Church on the far side of the green. If you look over to the right, you're going to see Main Street with a horse and buggy trotting down the road. Now if we just turn the camera and look down Main Street, just a little bit beyond where the trash barrels are today, is where that horse and buggy had been walking down the road. So there's a then and now, 1870 to 2020. And now we're standing in front of the home, the summer home of Albert Nye. Albert Nye built this home in 1849. Albert Nye's occupation was a commission merchant. I was able to find information about him in the 1850s down in New Orleans, and he's listed in a business directory in New Orleans saying his occupation was a commission merchant. So he had to be buying and selling things and making a commission on it. Anyway, he did pretty well for himself. And in the summer of in 1849, he built this home as a summer residence. He had married a woman named Henrietta Forbes who was from New Orleans, and he had a conversation with her that must have gone something like this. Hey honey, it's kind of hot and muggy down here in the summertime. How about if we build a house up in Falmouth, my hometown, where we can go for the summer months and it'll be much more comfortable? And maybe she said, oh, I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but perhaps. He said, well, how about this? I'll build you a house that looks like a house that we have down here in New Orleans. So the house that we're looking at right now was built to look like a New Orleans plantation house. Some of the features on the house that we're looking at now that would make it similar to a plantation house would be the porch that goes 360 degrees around the house. That's so that if it's sunny and you're hot, you can find shade by moving around to the side of the porch that has the shade. If you're too cool, you can sit on the sunny side of the porch. If you look at the windows on the first floor, they're very tall to the left and right of the front door. Those windows are called pocket windows. If you open up the window from the bottom, it'll go up into a pocket, and the window opens up far enough so that you can actually walk through the window by bending over a little bit, but still you can walk through. That's to get air to move through the house in the summertime. There's no air conditioning in 1849, so you need to have the windows open to get the air to move through the house. The hallway went from the front door right to the back door. It was a straight hallway with the rooms off to the side. The reason for that was, again, to let the air move through the hallway to keep the house cooler. The air would be sucked out of the rooms on the side. It's built up off the ground like the houses are down in New Orleans, and New Orleans is probably for flooding. Up here, it's not so much for flooding where this house is located, but the hired help, the kitchen, and the people that work down below, the laundry people and those sort of people, have a place to work below the main level of the house. It was the first house to be built exclusively as a summer residence, first house to be lit by gas lighting, first house to have a furnace in it. So a lot of firsts on this house, built in 1849. And I'll just keep the camera rolling, and we're going to spin around and look across the street. The house right across the street, that little white house, was originally the cottage, caretaker's cottage, the caretaker for the Albert Nye estate. And that cottage started out as a half-cape house. Look at the roof line. The top of the roof on the left-hand side is higher than it is on the right. The left-hand side is the original part of the house, and that would be called a half-cape house, and that was the caretaker's home for the Albert Nye estate. Folks, right now we're looking at a photograph of a young Catherine Lee Bates. Catherine Lee Bates was born in Falmouth, Massachusetts on August the 12th, 1859. She was born right in the house across the street from us. The flag and the plaque on the left-hand corner of the house indicate that that's her birthplace. The Bates family came to Falmouth in 1858. Catherine's father was a reverend. He had been hired as a minister of the Congregational Church, the big white church that we looked at. He died shortly after Catherine was born, leaving the family kind of stuck in Falmouth. Mrs. Bates and the kids stayed in Falmouth for the next 12 years, so Catherine grew up in Falmouth until the age of 12. Around the age of 12, Mrs. Bates moved the family to the Wellesley, Massachusetts area, where Catherine went to high school, attended Wellesley College, later became a professor of English at Wellesley College. In the summer of 1893, she was hired as to teach a course out in Colorado Springs, a summer college course. On the way out there, she went through Chicago. In 1893, the Chicago World's Fair was taking place. So she saw the World's Fair, and one of the things that she noticed about the fair was the buildings had been painted white. They were made to look like an old Greek city, so their buildings had sort of like false fronts on them, and they were painted white. That's one thing that stuck in her mind. Again, continuing on her train trip out to Colorado, she goes across the heartland of the country where the crops are growing, and sees the crops waving back and forth in the wind. These things are memories into her brain. Now she gets out to Colorado, and while she's there, she's invited to take a trip to the top of Pikes Peak Mountain. So she accepts the invitation and goes to the top of the mountain, and from the top of the mountain, she's looking out, and she sees purple mountains in the distance. And so I've read the accounts that she says that within about a half an hour of her being on the top of the mountain, all of the words to her poem, America the Beautiful, came into her mind. Things like the alabaster cities gleam, that was the Chicago World's Fair. The amber waves of grain, that was going across the country, seeing the grain flowing back and forth like an ocean. And then she gets to the top of the mountain and she sees the purple mountains' majesties. All these things come into her brain, and she developed that poem in a very short time. It was later set to music, and the poem is called America the Beautiful. It was almost selected as the country's national anthem. The next house that we're going to look at is the home of Captain Lewis Lawrence. Captain Lewis Lawrence was a captain of a whale ship, actually a Falmouth-built whale ship. I'll talk about that in a minute. Let's just talk about whaling in Falmouth in general for a moment. There were 13 whale ships that listed Falmouth as its home port. They actually sailed from Woods Hole because that's where the deep water port is. That's why the ferries leave from Woods Hole today. These ships made a total of 52 different voyages between them from 1820 to 1860. In total, 65 different Falmouth men commanded 161 different whaling voyages from 1789 to 1902. Probably the biggest player in the whaling industry in Falmouth was a man by the name of Elijah Swift. Elijah Swift owned or had interest in almost every Falmouth whale ship. He built several whale ships down in Woods Hole, right where the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution docks are today. That was the location of Elijah Swift's shipyard. Of the 532,000 barrels of whale oil that came into Woods Hole, all but 4,000 came in on Swift-owned whalers. So you have over 500,000 barrels coming in, and every single barrel that came in, except for 4,000 of those more than 500,000, were on Swift whalers. He was definitely the big player in town. I have a photograph of Elijah Swift right there. So this is the man who owned the shipyard, and this is a photograph of the Charles W. Morgan, a whale ship down in Mystic Seaport. In 1841, this ship was built. Also in 1841, Elijah Swift built a ship exactly the same size, 106 feet long, in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. So this ship was built in 1841. This ship is 106 feet long. The ship that Elijah Swift built in Woods Hole was also built in 1841. It was also 106 feet long. So you can pretty much say that this is the ship, or looks like what the ship would look like that Swift built in Woods Hole in 1841. He built at least 4 whale ships down in Woods Hole, but this would be the one that we're going to talk about now since we have the photograph. So if we just look across the street, we're going to be looking at the home of Captain Lewis Lawrence. Captain Lewis Lawrence was a whaling captain from Falmouth. He made 6 different voyages totaling 27 years. He had a wife by the name of Eunice who would occasionally accompany him on these trips. Now think about this for a minute. I'm going to tell you where Lewis Lawrence and his wife had their children born, and imagine today in 2020 you go to a cookout and you talk to somebody and you introduce yourself and say, hey, do you have any kids? Oh yeah, I have 3 kids. Oh, were they all born in Falmouth, I imagine? Oh no, I had a son born, Samuel, who was born in Tahiti. I had a son named Augustus who was born on Norfolk Island, which is over by New Zealand. And I had a son, Frederick, born in Hawaii. Well, Captain Lawrence had children born in those very places back in the 1840s, 1850s. And just imagine how he was able to see with his own eyes places in the world that people today still think are far off, distant places. So it's pretty amazing when you think about the adventures that these whaling captains had. We'll talk more about that. The home that we're looking at now is the retirement home of a whaling captain whose name was Thomas Lawrence. Thomas Lawrence is a brother of Lewis, whose home we just looked at. Captain Thomas Lawrence made 5 or 6 different whaling voyages. The records are a bit unclear. He was at sea for 20 years on those whaling voyages. He again would have his wife come with him occasionally. Her name was Mercy. They had a daughter Mary, born on Pitcairn Island, famous from Mutiny on the Bounty. And they also had a daughter named Amelia, who was born in the Azores. The whaling ships would sail east across the Atlantic, over by the Azores to catch the winds and the tides, and finally come down around the tip of South America and go up into the Pacific, sailing around looking for whales. One time, Captain Thomas Lawrence and his ship were on an outbound voyage. They were about to head out into the Pacific from a town called Valparaiso in the coast of Chile. While he was in Valparaiso, he noticed his brother Augustus's ship in port. He said, wow, this is great. I didn't know my brother would be here. His brother was also a whale ship captain. So he went ashore looking for his brother, found that the brother had recently died. He had the body exhumed and put him in a cask of some sort and carried him back to Falmouth on the ship, and he's buried in the Lawrence family plot up at the Oak Grove Cemetery. This house is the home of Thomas Lawrence. Thomas Lawrence was the father of all of the Lawrence boys who became whale ship captains. There were several boys. There was Thomas, his son Thomas. There was Lewis, there was Augustus, and there was Samuel. Later on in life, after Thomas, the owner of this house, passed away, his son Samuel inherited it. Samuel was a whale ship captain. I know more about Samuel than all the other Lawrence boys because in 1856 he left Fairhaven, Massachusetts on a whale ship by the name of the Addison. He had his 5-year-old daughter Minnie with him, and he had his wife Mary. So Mary, Samuel, and Minnie sail away from Fairhaven in 1856. They come back in 1860, all of them. It was a successful voyage, and during that time of the voyage, Mary kept a very detailed diary of life on board the ship. She documented things that the captain's log would never have bothered to contain. Things like Minnie having a doll in her hands, and the doll gets swept overboard, and Minnie is frantic because the doll is lost, and she wants her father to turn the whale ship around. Now, bear in mind, this is a big wooden ship with no engine, and they would have to turn that boat around and try to find the doll. It was impossible. So Minnie was beside herself with grief. She asked her mother to sew her a black mourning dress so that she could mourn the death of her doll. There was not enough black material on board the ship, but there was enough for Mary to sew a black mourning armband. So she did that. She sewed a black mourning band, which Minnie wore to mourn the death of her doll. While they were in Hawaii, Mary writes that she was absolutely astounded by the fact that the native people were bathing naked. They would actually swim in the ocean naked, and she thought that was just unheard of. She also talks about being out to sea and seeing another whale ship, and as the whale ships would approach each other, they would oftentimes stop alongside and have what they call a gam. They would talk to each other. The captains would exchange news. If the captains' wives were there, they would exchange news. Mary writes about being able to be rowed from one ship to another and have tea with another adult woman. She was the only adult woman on a ship with about 30 men on board and her daughter. So those were rare occasions for her to meet up with another woman at sea. She also talks about being in Hawaii and being able to sleep on a real bed that's not rocking and rolling. Those are the small things that she writes about. She kept a diary for the whole trip, and after the trip was over, the diary was put away and sort of forgotten about, and later on discovered, and a book was published of her diary. Now the name of her, let me talk about the hierarchy on the ship. You have the captain, first mate, second mate, third mate, and so on. The name of Mary's diary, which is written on the cover, is the captain's best mate. She's not first mate, second or third, she is the best mate. She considers herself to be sort of informally second in charge. So she writes a diary. It's later published as a book, and this is the cover of the book, which is on sale at the museum, and it's called The Captain's Best Mate. That's the title of her diary. It's the journal of Mary Chipman Lawrence on the whaler Addison from 1856 to 1860. The next part of the walk is going to be the Falmouth Mariners Memorial. We've talked a little bit about the mariners in Falmouth, Captain Baudfish, the various Lawrence whaling captains. And now we're at a rock with a plaque on it that is a memorial to all of those seafaring men from Falmouth. In 1907, this plaque was dedicated. Governor Curtis Garland from Massachusetts, the governor of Massachusetts, came down on a train. He was met at the train station by lots of people in Falmouth. They had a parade that went down Main Street. They went down Shore Street, and then they went along the ocean and finally came up Mill Road and ended at this rock. There were hundreds and hundreds of people at the ceremony. They say that all across the road were a big fan-shaped group of people. The plaque, which was dedicated in 1907, is the same time that we showed the gathering of people on the village green with the old bicycles and the old car and the lady in their white dress. So this plaque is a dedication to the memory of all the people from Falmouth that went to sea. We'll talk about some of them when we get to the burying ground that didn't make it home. You can see how dangerous it was. But if you look closely at the plaque, you can see the words on it that says, dedicated by the citizens and public school children of Falmouth in loving memory of her seamen, 1907. The way the money was raised for this memorial was the kids in Falmouth would throw their pennies into a jar or collect them around town, and they raised enough money to put up the plaque. The boulder came from Quisset, which is down the road about a mile or two, and it was in a person's yard. The word went out that the town was looking for a suitable stone to put a plaque on. The lady said, I have one in my yard, and that's where the stone came from, and the anchor I have not been able to find out where the anchor came from, but that's an anchor from an old ship. So this is 1907, the Falmouth Seamen's Memorial. Falmouth was first settled in 1660. The first people who came to Falmouth, who were English settlers, arrived in 1660. The town was settled between 1660 and 1661. Now, they didn't settle the area where the village green is. Everybody thinks that's the oldest part of Falmouth. We are actually standing right where those settlers lived. And we are on the corner of Mill Road and Locust Street, where the Mariners Memorial is. That is the general area where all of the first settlers lived. They came ashore down Mill Road this direction at the beach. They came from Barnstable. They were unhappy with the way things were going on in Barnstable, things about the church mostly. So they decided to come to Falmouth and start a new community. So what do you need when you're starting a new community from scratch? One of the first things you need is decent land. So here we are. We have flat, decent land, good for farming. The number one thing they were looking for was fresh water. They found a fresh water source right down this little dirt road. The dirt road actually leads to the burying ground. That's where the first two churches were. Remember, we said that Church 5 is the current white Congregational Church. Numbers 4 and 3 were on the village green. Numbers 2 and 1 were down the end of this dirt road. This dirt road is believed to be the oldest public way still in existence in Falmouth. This public way led to the town burying ground. It also led to the fresh water. So if you lived in an outlying little farm, a quarter of a mile, half a mile away, and you needed to get to the fresh water source, nobody could prevent you from getting to the fresh water source because there was a public way that led to that source of water. And we'll go down that in a minute. But I'd like to direct your attention to the plaque on the wall. I'll read the plaque because it's in the shadow. It says, "First Burying Ground. At the right of this entrance was the farm of Jonathan Hatch, the settler. At the left was the meeting house lot and training field with the burying ground in the rear. On this lot, 2 meeting houses were built, the first before 1700 and the second in 1715. In 1747, the proprietors ordered the meeting house lot to be sold, and in 1749, laid out a new meeting house lot in training ground, which is the current village green. Tablet was placed here by the town of Falmouth in 1930. In 1930, the town, through the efforts of Reverend Henry Herbert Smythe of the St. Barnabas Episcopal Church, put up 5 different bronze plaques to mark historical spots in Falmouth. Plaque number 1 would be on the Congregational Church. That talks about the Paul Revere Bell. Plaque number 2 is at the village green. Down at the tip of the green, there's a little wishing well. On that is a bronze plaque that tells the history of the green. This is bronze plaque number 3, the one that we just looked at. If you go down Mill Road in this direction, you get down to the ocean, there's a bronze plaque on a rock down at the ocean side that talks about that's the landing spot of the first settlers. You could almost say it's Falmouth's Plymouth Rock. If you go down to Woods Hole, there's a big stone building right on Water Street, which is today part of the Marine Biological Laboratory. The stone building is the only remaining building from the whaling era in Woods Hole. On the stone building is a plaque that talks about the building being a candle manufacturing building where they made candles from spermaceti whale oil. And it also talks about the whale ships that were built right across the street from the candle house. Remember what a nice day they finally had for that ceremony.
I know.
Man, it was crappy right up the hill.
I know, it just...
Is anybody coming to work at the museum besides you?
No. But I worked it out so that like Meg and Deb and Roseanne can all access their work work computers from their home computer. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, that's what Becky's doing. She's been working at home for 5 years.
yeah, and so I'll come in. I'll check the mail, and there's stuff for me to do. I mean, it you know, I'm not going to sit there and say I'm just sitting there totally twiddling my thumbs, but and in a lot of ways that I'm kind of working in lieu of the board. You know, it struck me, and I'm not saying that they're all wrong and I'm right, but it struck me how many people have, literally from the moment this took place, have just been in like abject terror. You know, like I'm not coming out from underneath my desk. You know, and I'm kind of like, well, live your life. You know, I mean, just watch the pay attention, follow the rules. Don't. Yeah, is that lightning?
I think it was during the storm, like a week or two ago, a week ago.
Yeah, look at the power lines low. Not that.
This would be kind of a good get a panorama of the place. Since this is one of the oldest burying grounds on the Cape, and this was the Falmouth burying ground back in the day, it's believed by members of the Sons of the American Revolution that this particular burying ground may have more Revolutionary War veterans buried in it than any other cemetery on Cape Cod. Other towns had different villages with their own separate cemeteries, so the veterans get spread out more. But in this cemetery, we have burying ground. We have 56 Revolutionary War veterans, 24 War of 1812 veterans, and 3 Civil War veterans. If you look while the camera's being panned, the headstones with the flags and the markers are all Revolutionary War veterans. Not every grave that's a Revolutionary War veteran has a flag on it, but some of them do. Now we're going to stand in front of a Cenotaph Stone. A Cenotaph Stone is a stone that's a memorial stone where the body is not necessarily present. This stone will be a very good indicator of how dangerous it was for these men to go to sea. If you remember the Mariners Memorial, it said dedicated to the seamen of Falmouth. This is one of the stones that indicates why that memorial stone was placed. It says, to the memory of William Thatcher, who was killed in falling from a loft on board the ship Eagle of Nantucket while lying in the harbor of Edgartown, November the 19th, 1821, age 16 years. 16-year-old boy fell out of the ship's rigging and was killed. Right below it, it says Captain Thomas L. Gibbs, who was lost at sea on his passage from Baltimore to Charleston, November of 1830, age 23 years. They're the sons of Herman and Martha Gibbs. Now if we stand up, and I want to point out, this is what's called the headstone. Behind the headstone, people often mistake these small stones for being a child's grave. This is actually the footstone that accompanies the headstone. If we come around and look at the back of the footstone, you'll see the initials are WT. That's for William Thatcher. That's whose grave this is. So this is William Thatcher's footstone. The bodies are buried on their back like a bed. The feet are down here by the footstone. The person's head will be up here by the headstone. The old burying grounds like this one are oriented east-west. You want to be buried so that when you rise up to meet the Lord, you're going to be facing east. You're going to be facing Jerusalem so that you can meet your Maker. So I just want to explain that that's the footstone to the headstone. This is the grave of Dr. Francis Wicks. Dr. Francis Wicks died at the age of 81 years old in 1836. He lived to be quite a long age. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner of his stone, it shows that he was a Revolutionary War soldier. Dr. Wicks, I read, may have been present at the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston. I'm not exactly sure, but that's one story that says he might have been. He's famous in Falmouth because he had a partner who was named Dr. Hugh Donaldson. Dr. Donaldson and Dr. Wicks were the two doctors that brought the smallpox inoculation idea to the citizens of Falmouth. People weren't worried about getting their children inoculated and vaccinated. They didn't know if it was a harmful thing or a good thing. In order to prove that it was a good thing, Dr. Donaldson vaccinated his own children. The people in town realized, okay, well, it didn't harm his children, and they didn't get smallpox, so I guess maybe it is a good idea. So Dr. Donaldson and Dr. Wicks were the two doctors that brought the smallpox inoculation to Falmouth. We're now standing in front of the grave of Captain Lot Dimmick. He died at 80 years old in 1817. Captain Lot Dimmick, as you can see by the marker, was a Revolutionary War veteran. Lot Dimmick is the brother of General Joseph Dimmick, whose grave we'll stop at next. I like this particular stone because of the very short and sweet epitaph on the bottom. If you look closely on his headstone, it says, "He merited this noblest of mottos, an honest man." 3 words says more about a person than 2 or 3 paragraphs could say. That says a lot about what kind of a man he was. They thought so much of him that that's all they had to put on his stone instead of some big, long, fancy epitaph. We're now standing in front of the grave of General Joseph Dimmick. He died September the 21st, 1822 at 89 years old. Again, lived a very long life. This particular person is probably one of the 2 or 3 most notable people that are buried in the Falmouth Old Burying Ground. Joseph Dimmick in 1775 was promoted to major. He was in charge of the local Falmouth militia. His instructors from the state government was, quote, "Instruct your men in the exercise of arms 2 days a week." Exercise of arms means firearms, means rifles, their muskets, their flintlocks. He drilled his men on the Falmouth Village Green, one of the first stops on the tour. When the news of the Battle of Bunker Hill reached Falmouth, the battle had occurred on June 17, 1775. Joseph Dimmick, whose grave we're in front of, and his son Braddock were out plowing their fields. When Major Dimmick was told of the battle, he said to Braddock, quote, "Here, Braddock, you must now look after the team. I must go." Braddock was only 14 years old. Joseph Dimmick left his 14-year-old son in charge of the farm while he went off to war. During the Revolutionary War, Joseph and his brother Lot, the honest man, were active in capturing British privateers in local waters. Then Major Dimmick defended Falmouth at the Surf Drive Beach on April the 2nd, 1779, during what's called the Battle of Falmouth, from a British fleet that fired upon the town from about 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Joseph Dimmick was promoted major in 1775, colonel in 1790, brigadier general in 1794. He was the high sheriff of Barnstable County for 25 years, a state senator for 3 years, and he also served at Fort Ticonderoga. It's people like Joseph Dimmick, who you hardly ever hear anything about, that are the reason that we have a free United States of America today. These are the unsung heroes of the Revolutionary War who rest in small town burying grounds, unknown, unappreciated, and we have to learn to respect these people and come visit their graves, honor their memory, and make sure that we pass down their accomplishments and their deeds to the younger generations of Falmouth. This is a replacement headstone that was put up in 1991. The original headstone is just to the right of it, which is no longer legible. But this is the grave of Jonathan Hatch. If you read the stone, it says Jonathan Hatch died December 1710, age 84 years. Below that, it says settler of Falmouth, friend of Indians. When the town was settled in 1660, Jonathan Hatch and 13 families came to Falmouth to establish a new town. Jonathan Hatch had been to Falmouth before it was a town, before people really lived here. He had come here and befriended the Indians, and they taught him how to hunt and fish and show him trails that led around this part of the Cape. And so he became friendly with the Indians. So when the first settlers came to Falmouth, Jonathan Hatch was already familiar with the area a little bit, and the Indians knew him, so they knew they could trust him. They knew he was an okay guy, and made it a little bit easier for the town to become established because Jonathan Hatch was one of the first settlers, and he had a connection with the Indians, and that's why it says right on his stone, friend of Indians. He treated the Indians as equals, which a lot of people did not do back in those days. So we're standing in the burying ground, and when we first started down the oldest public way in Falmouth, the dirt road that leads to the burying ground and the fresh water, I just wanted to show you how close the water is to the burying ground. The water that's behind the stone wall used to be called Fresh Pond because of the fresh water supply that it provided to the first settlers of Falmouth. Today it's named Sitter's Pond after a man whose name was Consider Hatch, who owned property that used to adjoin the pond. The pond today is brackish. It has a culvert that goes under the street and comes out to the ocean, so it's not as fresh as it used to be. But this used to be the fresh water supply for the first settlers of Falmouth. That's why they settled in this particular part of Falmouth, because they had good land, friendly with the Indians, and fresh water. We're now standing on the grounds of the St. Barnabas Episcopal Church. This church was built in 1890, paid for primarily by a wealthy Falmouth summer resident whose name was E. Pearson Beebe. The Beebes were wealthy because they owned, I believe, some textile mills and department stores, and they came to Falmouth in the late 1800s to get away from city life. The only Episcopal church in Falmouth back in those days was in Woods Hole, 4 miles away. That's a long way to go. So Mr. Beebe decided to create his own Episcopal church here in downtown Falmouth. The architectural style of the church, from what I have read, is called English Country Manor. And the church building, of course, is the one who I'm pointing to right now. The administrative offices and building was right there. And if we pan to the right, this sort of long building with the round windows in it was originally the carriage house. Today, the carriage house is used as a chapel. But if you look at the rocks that the buildings are made of, they're mostly pink granite. Falmouth was a very well-known place to get pink granite. If you look around Falmouth, old construction areas, old buildings, old sidewalk curbstones, old steps of buildings, oftentimes you will find that they are made of pink granite. So I'm assuming that most of the pink granite stones that were used in the construction of these church buildings came from Falmouth. Now, the landscape architect for the property itself was Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted is a very famous landscape architect. He did Central Park, I believe, in New York. He did a series of parks around Boston called the Emerald Necklace. He did parks and nature preserve areas all over the United States, and the Beebes were fortunate enough to hire his company to do the landscape architecture of the St. Barnabas Episcopal Church. And this, by the way, is the church where the Reverend Henry Herbert Smythe preached, and he was one of the founders of the Falmouth Historical Society, which operates the museums on the green. He was the man who was instrumental in getting those 5 historic bronze plaques put around town. He was also the person who, in about 1900, he realized that all of the headstones in the old burying ground were becoming deteriorated to the point where you could almost not read what was on them. He crawled around on his hands and knees for a whole summer, recording what was written on every stone, and then he made a map of where the stone was located, and at least several of those big maps are still in existence today. I think the museums still have one, but it was Henry Herbert Smythe who was the one who was instrumental in preserving what is written on those stones. You can almost barely read a lot of the stones today, but Henry Herbert Smythe wrote down what was on there so that we wouldn't lose memory of all the people that are buried back there. Earlier in the videos, we talked about the 5 bronze plaques that were placed in 1930. This is one of the 5. This is at the end, the east end of the Falmouth Village Green. You can see the wishing well that the plaque is mounted on, and I have a photograph that was taken of the dedication ceremony. You can see the wishing well and you can see the plaque. I don't know who these 2 men are. I've tried to identify them, but I haven't been able to find out. But it says the meeting house lot and training field. The proprietors ordered the old purchase at a meeting held on the 6th of October, 1749. Agreed that there should be part of that lot of land called the meeting house lot and training field, about 1.5 acres, to lay perpetually to that end. The 3rd meeting house, the first on this site, was completed in 1756. The 4th meeting house, the second on this site, was built in 1796. This house was sold in 1857, dismantled, and the frame moved to the present site, which is where the white church is now. The elm trees around the lot were given by Elijah Swift and set out in 1832 by Ephraim Sanford. To perpetuate the memory of these events, the town of Falmouth erected this monument in 1930. And then right next to the monument across the street is the old Falmouth National Bank. That bank was founded in 1821 by Elijah Swift, the man that owned all the whale ships, that made all the money in the whaling business, and also the selling of live oak trees to the Navy to build Navy warships. The bank was built in 1821, like I said, by Elijah Swift. It was the longest continually operating bank in one location on Cape Cod until just a couple of years ago. The bank had evolved into the Bank of America, and the Bank of America closed the doors maybe a year or 2 ago. So it just missed a 200th anniversary by a couple of years. And folks, welcome to the grounds of the Falmouth Museums on the Green. I'd like to point out a few of the buildings we have and explain their use and a little bit of the history of them. Over to my right, you'll see a flagpole with the American flag, and the house to the far left is called the Conant House, named after one of the previous owners. It was built circa 1730. To the back side of the house is the new addition that was put on a few years ago. The new addition houses the offices for the museum. It houses the paper collection, the collection of old, for instance, ship's logs and other documents and things like that. That's where the museum archivist works. And then if we swing to the left, we'll see the Colonial Boxwood garden looking through the gazebo out to the garden. The garden is maintained by the Falmouth Garden Club. They have been doing so since the mid-1940s. They do a wonderful job. Going a little further to the left is the Dr. Francis Wicks house. We saw Dr. Wicks's grave at the burying ground. He's the one that brought the smallpox inoculation to Falmouth. That house was built in 1790 in I believe it's a federal period house, which means it was built after the federal government was in existence. The back side of the house was in need of repair, so that is being repaired and strengthened and put a new roof on, and it'll be painted. There's also a new handicap access ramp. And then swinging a little bit more to the left is the barn and the cultural center. The cultural and exhibit center is to the left. The barn is actually where the gift shop is today. The cultural center is large enough to hold probably a little over 100 people for lectures, small wedding receptions, teacher meetings, things like that. It can be rented from the museum. The back side of the cultural center has ultra-modern restrooms and an ultra-modern kitchen. And down below it all is storage area for the larger, harder artifacts, things like farm implements and things that would not fit in a bookcase. That's a little quick tour of the museum and its grounds.